They say every family in America has secrets, but some secrets were never meant to be spoken. Buried in the dirt beneath crumbling houses, locked in faded photographs, hidden behind smiles that never reach the eyes. This story begins in the heart of Appalachia, a town so small it's barely a name on the map. Yet for over a century, its people carried a bloodline that whispered of shame, madness, and something far darker. For generations, no one asked questions. You didn't talk about what happened up on the ridge, or why certain families never left their homes during daylight. But behind those boarded windows, something was festering, a truth too heavy for words. It started with a marriage that shouldn't have happened, a brother and sister bound not by love, but by fear. Fear of being left alone after the war, fear of losing the land their family had owned since before the Civil War. Fear of outsiders, of judgment, of discovery. So they made a choice that would stain every generation after them. The children that came after were different. Their eyes were too close together, their voices carried strange lilts, and their minds. Well, some say they saw things that weren't there, but the townsfolk turned a blind eye, because to acknowledge the truth meant facing their own complicity. The preacher kept his silence. The sheriff pretended not to notice, and the children kept being born. In old journals, you can still find their names, scratched into yellowed pages, ink faded by time. The same surnames repeated over and over, the bloodline tightening, twisting, until it could barely breathe. And if you go there today, some say you can still hear the echoes. Whispers of a family that tried to keep itself pure, only to rot from the inside out. But what really happened on that ridge? And why did the government finally step in after nearly 100 years of silence? Because this story, America's darkest family secret, didn't just destroy one home. It infected an entire town. And tonight we're going to uncover the truth they tried to erase. The story of the ridge begins in 1865, the year the war ended and the world came home broken. Most men returned to nothing, burned fields, empty houses, silence where families once laughed. But for the McCullens family, isolation was a choice. They had land, 50 acres of Appalachian rock and forest, and a single farmhouse at the top of a hill that the locals came to call the Quiet Rise. After the father's death, 2 children remained, Thomas and Eliza McCullens. The siblings were young, barely 20, and too poor to leave. The war had stripped them of everything except each other. And in that loneliness, something inside them twisted. Neighbors would later say they kept to themselves too much, that the sound of a baby's cry from that house didn't make sense, because no one had seen a husband or a wife. When whispers began to spread, Thomas built a high fence around the property. He stopped going into town. Eliza stopped attending church. Within a few years, their family became a ghost story told to scare children into staying close to home. But it wasn't just rumor. Records from 1872 show a birth registered to E. McCullens. No father listed. Then another and another. The line continued, child after child, all born under the same roof, all with the same blood. The locals turned away, maybe out of disgust, maybe out of guilt. The McCullens children rarely attended school. When they did, they sat in the back, silent and strange. Teachers wrote that they were difficult to manage. Some couldn't read past the age of 12. Some never spoke. Others wandered the woods for hours, muttering to themselves. The town doctor visited once, called up by a report of sickness. He left pale and trembling, muttering that he'd never go back. When asked what he saw, he only said, "There are some things that shouldn't be." By the early 1900s, the McCullens family had become a stain on the land itself, a reminder of what happens when love turns inward and never lets the light in. Their home began to decay, yet somehow they never left it. But the strangest thing, no matter how many of them died, the name on the deed never changed. It was always signed by a McCullens. By the 1920s, the world had moved on. Cars on dirt roads, radios in every home, new faces coming to the mountains in search of coal and promise. but not on the quiet rise. The McCullens remained untouched by time, sealed within their world like a wound that refused to heal. Travelers spoke of lights flickering in the windows long after midnight, though the house had no electricity. Others told of shapes moving in the woods. Too pale, too silent, too still. But the people in town had learned their lesson generations earlier. You didn't go up there, and you didn't ask why. One story, passed down from a mail carrier named Lewis Crane, described a night he was forced to deliver a letter by hand, the first government correspondence the McCullens had received in decades. He rode up the ridge and found the house surrounded by mist, the porch sagging under years of neglect. A woman opened the door, barefoot, her hair gray though her face was young. Behind her, children stood in a line, watching. He said their eyes were identical. Every single one. Lewis claimed that as he handed her the letter, she smiled, not kindly but knowingly, and said, "We've been expecting you." He rode away so fast his horse collapsed halfway down the hill. The letter was from a state agency investigating reports of missing persons. Someone had vanished near the quiet rise, a prospector, last seen looking for mineral veins along the creek bed below the McCullen property. No trace of him was ever found. The family denied everything, but within a week, the investigators stopped asking questions. Because in those mountains, power didn't come from money. It came from silence, the kind of silence that's bought with fear. A local historian named Beatrice Holt later described the McCullens as a living relic of America's original sin, isolation turned inward, morality eaten alive by blood. But Holt didn't stop there. She spent years digging through records, uncovering court files, censuses, and private letters. What she found was more disturbing than any rumor. She found evidence of births that never should have been possible, and deaths that were never recorded. And one letter, written in 1933, that contained 6 words which would haunt her until the day she died. "We are not meant for the world." Beatrice Holt couldn't let it go. She was a teacher by trade, a historian by obsession. When she read those 6 words, "We are not meant for the world," she knew they weren't metaphor. They were confession. The letter had been signed by Eleanor McCullen, the last known matriarch of the Ridge. In 1934, Holt made the journey up to the quiet rise herself. She brought a journal, a camera, and a revolver she swore she'd never use. What she found defied everything she believed about history, about humanity, about what it means to survive. The path to the house was overgrown. The trees leaned toward her, as if listening. By the time she reached the property, dusk had fallen, and the air hung thick, heavy with decay and the faint stench of something sweet. The farmhouse sagged against the hillside like it was trying to sink back into the earth. Holt wrote that she knocked 3 times. No one answered, but she heard movement inside. Footsteps, whispering, a door creaking open. When she finally stepped through the threshold, the air was wrung. The temperature dropped. The light dimmed. And there they were, 6 of them, sitting around a table unmoving, their faces pale and almost identical. Eleanor was at the head. She didn't speak for a long time, just watched. Studied Holt with eyes that didn't blink. Then, finally she said, "You shouldn't have come here. We don't belong with your kind." Holt asked what she meant, and Eleanor smiled, slow and tired. "We were meant to end here," she said, "but they keep being born. They keep being born, and I can't stop them." When Holt asked who they were, the room fell silent. One of the children began to hum, a low, broken tune, the same note repeated over and over. The others joined in, until it became unbearable. Holt ran. She made it halfway down the ridge before she realized she still held her camera. But when the photos were developed, nothing appeared. Just black frames. Except one. The final photo, faint, blurred, impossible to explain, showed the old house behind her. And in the window, something watching. Something that looked human, but wasn't. Years later, Holt vanished. Her journal was found in her attic. pages soaked from what looked like rainwater. But the night she disappeared, it hadn't like rained at all. And tucked inside the final page, scrawled in the same handwriting as that letter from 1933, were those 6 words again. We are not meant for the world. By the 1950s, the Quiet Rise had become more than a ghost story. It was a curse whispered among coal miners and drifters passing through. Teenagers dared each other to walk past the gate after sundown. None ever made it far. Some came back pale and trembling, others didn't come back at all. The sheriff blamed the woods, the rivers, the mines. Anything but the truth that everyone already knew. In 1956, the McCullens family name resurfaced when a county worker filed a report after discovering human bones near the creek bed. They were small, too small. Forensics later suggested they belonged to a child. No burial marker, no coffin, just shallow soil and scattered roots. When authorities went to question the McCullens, they found only 2 people left alive, a woman in her 80s and a boy who wouldn't speak. The woman, identified as Margaret McCullen, was nearly blind. She claimed not to remember anything. When pressed about the bones, she said only, "We bury what God rejects." The boy sat beside her, humming that same low, broken tune Beatrice Holt had written about 2 decades earlier. That's when the state finally stepped in. The farmhouse was condemned, the property seized, and the remaining family taken into custody. But when social workers tried to trace the rest of the bloodline, the trail vanished. Names appeared in census records, then disappeared. Births were recorded, but no deaths. It was as if the McCullens existed only when they wanted to, and then simply faded. Still, the investigators tried to dig deeper. They found signs of something older buried beneath the house, stone foundations that didn't match the architecture of the 1800s. They unearthed both bones. Not one, but dozens, generations. A lineage of the forgotten, and then the reports stopped. Files went missing, evidence misplaced. Some say the government buried the truth because they feared what it meant. A pocket of humanity left behind, a bloodline that refused to evolve. Others believe something else entirely. That what lived up there on the Quiet Rise wasn't human anymore. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you hide it? Or end it? Because the truth is, the McCullens story doesn't end in the 1950s. It's only when the modern world returned to that ridge, with cameras, drones, and curiosity, that the real horror began. In 1991, a documentary crew from Kentucky set out to film a series on forgotten Appalachian towns. Places erased by time, swallowed by forest. They weren't looking for ghosts or legends. But when they asked locals about the Quiet Rise, the air in the diner went still. One old man set down his coffee, leaned in close, and said, "You don't go up there after dark." Of course, they went anyway. The footage was never aired, but fragments of it survived. A cameraman named Daniel Rees mailed a rough cut to his brother before the tapes disappeared into government archives. What's on them is difficult to describe. It begins like any backwoods exploration, laughter, nervous jokes, the crunch of boots through leaf rot. Then the house appears, slouched against the horizon like it's been waiting. The team approaches, joking about ghosts. The tone changes when the sound cuts, replaced by a static hum that pulses in rhythm with their footsteps. Inside, the house is untouched, dust thick as velvet, furniture exactly as Beatrice Holt had described 60 years earlier. And then, faintly, the humming starts. That same tune, the one Holt heard, the one the boy had sung beside Margaret McCullen. Low, monotonous, endless. One crew member whispers, "Do you hear that?" The camera jerks toward a corner. Something moves, not fast, not violent, just wrong. A shape crouched, facing the wall, its skin pale as paper. When they shine the light, it doesn't flinch. It just keeps humming. Then blackout. When the image returns, it's morning. The crew is outside, the camera still rolling, abandoned in the dirt. The sky is gray, and there's a figure standing in the distance. Motionless, just watching. Police found the van at the base of the ridge 2 days later, empty, no bodies. Only the camera, the tapes, and a journal written by Daniel himself. The final page read, "They never left. They don't die. They just wait. The ridge belongs to them." The government sealed off the land soon after, declaring it an environmental hazard zone. The official story was radiation contamination from old mines. But there are no mines on the quiet rise. And yet, locals still say that if you stand on the road at night, just before the fog rolls in, you can hear it. A low, unbroken hum drifting from the trees. The song of the McCullens. Time has a way of erasing what we can't bear to remember. Maps change, towns disappear, graves sink back into the soil. But the land doesn't forget. The quiet rise still sits where it always has, hidden under ivy and rot, a scar the earth refuses to heal. And though the farmhouse collapsed decades ago, people who live nearby say they still see lights moving where the windows used to be. The McCullen family became a warning, a whisper told around campfires, a reminder of what happens when blood turns inward, when secrets breed in silence. But the truth runs deeper than that. This wasn't just a story about inbreeding, or madness, or sin. It was about what isolation does to the human soul, about how fear, shame, and loneliness can twist love into something monstrous. Historians tried to dismiss it as folklore. They said Beatrice Holt fabricated her journals, that Daniel Reese's tapes were part of a hoax. But the problem with legends is that they always start with a grain of truth. In 2017, a hiker uploaded a video to an online forum, shaky footage of an overgrown foundation, scattered bones, and a single word carved into stone: McCullen. Authorities removed the video within hours. The user's account vanished, but for those who saw it before it disappeared, the final frame was unmistakable, a faint figure standing in the doorway, watching. No one knows if it was real. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. Maybe not. But here's what we do know. Every few years, someone still disappears near that ridge. Their belongings are found, their cars abandoned, their names added to lists that no one updates. And when the wind moves just right across the hills, it carries that same strange hum. The song that's haunted this land for over a century. Maybe it's just memory. Maybe it's something left behind. Because the McCullens story was never really about one family. It's about the darkness that lives inside us all. The part that whispers, stay where it's safe, stay with your own, keep the blood pure. That whisper destroyed them. But it's still here, waiting for anyone who dares to listen. So the next time you find yourself driving through the back roads of Appalachia and you see an old fence covered in moss, don't stop. Don't look too long. Because some families were never meant for the world.